50 years ago today, just after 2 p.m. on the 10th of Tishrei, 5734, corresponding to October 6, 1973, Syria and Egypt attacked Israel from the north and the south. The Egyptian forces managed to cross Israel's defensive Bar Lev line, a fortified sand wall on the east bank of the Suez Canal. On the northern front, Syrian infantry crossed the ceasefire line in the Golan Heights, known as the Purple Line, and 2 hours later captured a key vantage point on Mount Hermon. A close Israeli friend of mine, Chedva Cohn, remembers well the start of the Yom Kippur War. Although some Israelis were caught by surprise, many had an inkling that war was in the offing. Chedva's 3 older brothers were doing their compulsory army service at the time and were not allowed to come home for the Yom Kippur holiday, which raised suspicions in Chedva's family. Chedva's father, Zachariah, was in synagogue praying on Yom Kippur when someone from the military came to fetch him because he had a car and could ferry soldiers to their bases. Chedva remembers her mother, Rachel, preparing a meal for Zachariah so that he could take something to eat on the road. When recounting that day to me recently on a Zoom call, Chedva started to cry. My father had never eaten or driven on Yom Kippur. We knew the situation must be grave. Chedva's boyfriend at the time, and now husband, David, who goes by the nickname of Dudu, was an officer who had recently finished his army service. He didn't yet have a reserve assignment, so the army assigned him to a makeshift unit. Dudu and his company were sent to defend the road between Jericho and Jerusalem in case Jordan attacked. When no attack followed, Dudu was sent first to the Golan Heights and then to Sinai, where he witnessed horrific scenes of death of both Egyptians and Israelis. While the hostilities ended in a ceasefire after a few weeks, Dudu remained in the Sinai on duty for 6 more months. Both Chedva and Dudu remember the existential fear that gripped Israel during that time, particularly in the first days of the war, as some Israelis huddled in bomb shelters and Israel suffered massive casualties on 2 fronts. As I recount these events, I know that some of you will have your own memories of hearing about the war as you sat in synagogue that year and of following closely as the war unfolded. It was a terrifying time for Israelis and for Jews worldwide as Israel's future looked uncertain. Hearing about it tonight might bring up memories of that fear and concern. Just hearing me speak about Israel may bring up feelings. My colleague, Rabbi Sharon Brous, calls preaching about Israel death by Israel sermon. So here goes nothing. Maybe you're eager to hear what I have to say or concerned that I'll say something that is troubling or that you might not agree with. Whatever feelings are arising in you now, I encourage you, just notice them, take a deep breath. Tomorrow we'll have the chance to unpack what I say and talk about it together during our afternoon Yom Kippur study time. Now, why have I begun by talking about the Yom Kippur War, which probably feels like ancient history to some of those under 60? Well, in part because we are marking the 50th anniversary of that war, which brought Israel perilously close to military collapse and sparked fears of Israel being overrun by Arab armies. But there's an additional reason as well. Today, 50 years later, Israel faces a very different kind of crisis. Thankfully, there are no bomb shelters involved, yet many Israelis also see this crisis as existential for the country they love, and I share their concern. Since the beginning of the year, this crisis has brought thousands of Israelis into the streets every week. The protests began modestly with 20 to 30,000 demonstrators, but quickly swelled until one Saturday night in March, 500,000 people gathered in downtown Tel Aviv. 500,000 in a country with a population of around 9 million. Imagine what that would mean in a country of, say, 330 million, like the United States. Well, since, as you know, I was an applied math major in college, I can tell you off the top of my head that would be like having 18 million people gathered in Millennium Park. I'm not sure the park is big enough to hold all those people. The protests in Israel have continued to draw hundreds of thousands into the streets of Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jerusalem, and throughout the country every Saturday night. The judicial overhaul that the current government is proposing has these Israelis concerned that their country could face a very different kind of collapse from the one they and their parents and their grandparents feared in October 1973, one brought about through a systematic attack on the country's judicial system. Proponents of the so-called judicial reform, others are calling it a judicial coup, claim they are simply reining in an activist judiciary and restoring sovereignty to the people. But it's important to understand that Israel's Supreme Court is the only check on the executive and legislative branches of the country's government. Additionally, unlike in the US system, Israel has only a single House of Parliament. So there's no other legislative body, regionally or nationally, that can serve as a counterweight to the Knesset. Finally, Israel has no constitution or Bill of Rights to protect individual rights or the rights of minorities against the will of the majority. As a result, many Israelis, especially secular Israelis, like my friends Chedva and Dudu Cohen, who are passionate Israeli patriots, fear that Israel may not continue to be a safe and healthy democracy in which they and their children and grandchildren can thrive. So what is behind the proposed judicial overhaul? The current government is comprised of an unprecedented number of parties that want to solidify the Orthodox rabbinate's influence on government budgets, military service, and personal status issues. Already, as Reformed Jews know well, Israel's Orthodox rabbinate controls marriages, divorces, and conversions, as well as authority over religious practices and holy sites, such as the Western Wall. The government's Minister of Welfare has called for preventing LGBTQ couples from adopting children, and there are many proposals to further curtail the rights and freedoms of non-Orthodox Israelis. Additionally, proponents of the judicial overhaul want to permanently exempt yeshiva students from military service, long a source of resentment for those who serve in the military, and especially those who have lost loved ones in uniform. Among the supporters of the overhaul are government ministers who want to earmark more of the national budget for Orthodox institutions. Finally, the government includes outspoken and influential politicians who seek to permanently annex the West Bank while denying citizenship rights to the West Bank's Palestinian inhabitants. Weakening the country's Supreme Court will remove a major barrier to the achievement of these anti-democratic goals. It will also allow extremists to institutionalize a system of discrimination that favors Orthodox over non-Orthodox, men over women, straight people over LGBTQ Israelis, and Jews over Palestinians. Speaking at a conference several years ago, the government's Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, made it clear that the judicial overhaul will, I quote, allow us and will make it much easier for us to take tangible steps on the ground that strengthen the process of advancing sovereignty over the West Bank. Millions of Israelis are fearful of what will happen to their country under the sway of the out-and-out racists who are serving in the government. Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir, in his youth, was a supporter of Meir Kahana's Kach party, which was barred from the Knesset in the 1990s because of its explicitly racist views. Ben-Gvir himself was barred from serving in the army because of his extremism. And until recently, Ben-Gvir proudly displayed in his home a photograph of Baruch Goldstein, the American-born physician and settler who infamously gunned down and killed 29 Muslims and wounded more than 100 while they were praying in the cave of Machpelah in Hebron on Purim in 1994. Just a few weeks ago, Ben-Gvir said, "My right and my wife's and my children's right to get around on the roads in Judea and Samaria is more important than the right to movement for Arabs." The State Department roundly condemned his remarks as racist, but he remains a minister in Israel's government and an influential advocate of the judicial overhaul. Another government minister, Bezalel Smotrich, commented after settlers rampaged the Palestinian village of Hawara in the West Bank last February that Hawara needs to be wiped out and the state of Israel should do it. Other villages have experienced a similar fate to Hawara. The firebrand politicians I've just mentioned are among the most outspoken of the extremists in the Israeli government, but they are, by far, not the only ones. When I was in Israel in February, I protested with Chedva and Dudu in Tel Aviv and captured this photo of Dudu alongside a fellow veteran of the Yom Kippur War. Dudu's on the left. The man on the right in his sign, it reads, "A fighter from the 1973 Yom Kippur War battles over the character of the country." When we were at the protest, Dudu saw this man, knew he was a fellow soldier from 73, and wanted this picture taken. Chedva and Dudu's lives as Israelis are a testament to Israel's role as a haven for Jews from the diaspora and of the vibrant society that has been created. Chedva's parents came from Yemen, not speaking a word of modern Hebrew, and raised her and her 4 brothers in Givatayim, a working-class suburb of Tel Aviv. Dudu was born in Morocco to an Arabic and French-speaking family and came to Israel as a child of humble immigrants as well. No, that's not me on the left. That's my mother. But she's younger than I am in that picture, kind of incredible. Here's a photo I treasure of my mother with Dudu's father at a family celebration at their home in Givatayim many years ago. The Cohens raised 2 daughters in Givatayim and have 6 grandchildren, one of whom will soon enlist in the military intelligence unit. Chedva and Dudu have good jobs and live a comfortable life, surrounded by family and friends and a vibrant Jewish culture. But they fear that the changes envisioned by Israel's government threaten all of that. They have an additional worry because one of their daughters is gay. She and her wife are raising 3 children together. They're concerned about their rights, freedom, and safety, and see the Supreme Court as the last bastion of those rights. This is a picture of both Chedva and Dudu here at the protests. They've gone every week since January. The Cohens are aware that all of Israel's problems didn't just appear when this government was formed late last year. For example, tensions have been rising with the ultra-Orthodox community for decades over issues of public spending and military service. Meanwhile, life in the West Bank has become increasingly unbearable for Palestinians as settlements have grown and expropriated more land and resources. Palestinian shepherds are often chased off their grazing lands by armed settlers. Several Palestinian villages have picked up their belongings and left because of Jewish settler violence. But it wasn't until the judicial overhaul was proposed that many Israelis fully appreciated that their freedoms, their way of life, and their democratic rights were at risk. A recent poll found that 28% of Israelis are considering leaving the country, one of the world's most resilient and technologically advanced economies, amid the judicial upheaval. What is happening to this safe haven for Jews? Not only have some Israelis left or considered leaving the country, some in Israel's revered high-tech sector have proposed relocating their businesses or allowing their employees to work from Portugal, imagine, or other locations if the judicial overhaul proceeds. When we think about conflict in Israel, we usually see it as Jews versus Palestinians. Perhaps that is because we have put blinders on as the growing demographic changes there, especially the growth and the growing political strength of the ultra-Orthodox segment of society, have exposed a fundamental weakness in Israel's system of government. Today, it's more and more apparent that the conflict is between those who want to see Israel as a vibrant liberal democracy and those who would like to curtail the rights of non-Jews and non-Orthodox Jews and permanently entrench Israeli control over the West Bank while depriving its Palestinian inhabitants of basic rights. To be clear, not all Orthodox Jews support the judicial overhaul. There are lots of Orthodox Jews in Israel who hold progressive values, and there are even some West Bank settlers who have recently protested the proposed changes to the judiciary. However, the Orthodox parties in the Knesset are pushing hard for the overhaul, even though they did not win a majority of the votes in the last election. That is because several small parties failed to meet the electoral threshold to enter the Knesset, giving greater power to Netanyahu's bloc. You may ask, why as American Jews should we obsess over this domestic dispute in Israel? For some, this seems obvious. We have deep connections and feelings about Israel. We may have family and friends there, value opportunities to spend time there, and believe we need to ensure its safety and stability as a safe haven for the Jewish people. Others among us may have a more tenuous relationship with Israel or have become distant from Israel because of its policies towards Palestinians or toward Reform Jews. However, as American Jews, we have a right to participate in the evolution of the one country in the world that identifies itself as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Moreover, Israelis are asking us to take a stand against the current extremism and to stand in solidarity with those who are protesting the judicial overhaul. When I was in Israel for my Reform Rabbis Convention, in February, I heard the head of the North American Reform Movement, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, address in Hebrew the protesters in Tel Aviv. That was a proud moment for me as a Reformed Jew. And Israeli friends were moved and heartened to see the leader of the largest denomination in North America show an understanding and appreciation for the issues and values at stake. Even some Israelis who have been more centrist or even right-wing have encouraged American Jews to support the protesters. Rabbi Daniel Gordis and journalist Yossi Klein Halevi and Mati Friedman recently published this plea to American Jews. A government that won just 48.4% of the popular vote, and which did so only after concealing from the electorate the sweeping nature of its plans, has dared to tamper with the basic identity of the state and has led us into a crisis from which our society might not recover. The voice of fundamentalist religion is emboldened. This unprecedented threat requires unprecedented changes in the diaspora's relationship with Israel. Diaspora support for Israel has traditionally taken the form of support for its government, but now the greatest threat facing Israel is its government. The greatest threat facing Israel is its government. Jews in the diaspora can no longer support Israel without asking which Israel they are supporting. End quote. This year, Israelis who live outside of Israel started a movement called Unacceptable, which has been organizing protests around the world in support of the pro-democracy protesters. We have been protesting in solidarity here in Evanston since February. At the most recent demonstration on September 10th, one of our Beth Emet teens who spent last semester in Israel, Lila Selch, there she is, spoke beautifully and passionately, concluding her remarks by saying, "I am not speaking out with hate, I'm speaking out with love. I know our country can be better, and I know we have the right to a government that values peace and democracy." Well said, Lila. Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, sitting right here in the front row, was one of the lead signatories on a letter in Congress in support of the protests. At the Evanston protests at the end of July, she spoke and was cheered by all who were present, especially the Israelis in the crowd. One of the leaders of Unacceptable flew all the way in from the Bay Area to be with us and to thank Jan personally. It can be difficult to express criticism of Israel given our history of persecution, given the pride we take in Israel's accomplishments, which are truly extraordinary, and given the fear that criticism of Israel could undermine its security. It's important to acknowledge our history, the trauma our people have experienced, and the very real threats Israel faces from enemies near and far, without letting those factors cloud our vision for the future and our ability to stand with millions of fellow Jews whose values we share. This is what we need to do today to keep Israel secure and to signal our support for a democratic future for Israeli Jews of every variety and for Palestinians as well. A few weeks ago, I saw the Golda movie. Who's seen it? Oh, good number. I recommend it. Found it very emotional. The movie about Golda Meir focuses on the Yom Kippur War. For me, the most poignant scene was when Henry Kissinger comes to Golda Meir's house in Israel. He's trying to negotiate a ceasefire and has just been with the Russians before arriving in Israel. He sits down at Golda's kitchen table, and she insists he eat the borscht that her cook, who is a survivor of the Shoah, has prepared. As they begin their conversation, he says to Golda, and I won't try to do Henry Kissinger's accent, "I want to let you know that I'm an American, Secretary of State, and a Jew, in that order." "That's okay," she replies. "In Israel, we read from right to left." It's a light moment in a heavy film, but it also captures the essence of what it means to live as a Jew in the 20th century. Golda Meir was born in Kyiv, and her family had to flee because of violence against Jews. She grew up in Milwaukee and then came to Israel as a young adult, becoming the first and only female prime minister of Israel. Henry Kissinger was born Heinz Alfred in Germany. He immigrated to the U.S. in 1938. The disruption and trauma of 20th century Jewish life was encapsulated in this kitchen table scene, a stark reminder of the death and destruction experienced by the Jewish world, the massive waves of Jewish emigration from Europe, mostly to the U.S. and Israel, and the choices that Jews had to make about their identity as they created new lives for themselves. When I'm in Israel, as I will be again later this week, I'm acutely aware that the trauma of 20th century Jewish life persists today and is in some ways amplified in Israeli society and has an impact on its actions. With the upsurge of anti-Semitism in this country, we are also feeling more vulnerable. I have a sense of Israelis' trauma based on my 3 years living in Israel and many subsequent visits. My first year of rabbinic school was during the first Gulf War, when we donned gas masks nightly for several weeks, as ballistic missiles were fired into the country. And later I was in Israel during the Second Intifada, when suicide bombings were an almost daily occurrence. This was Cantor Young's first year of cantorial school. The conflict with the Palestinians and with neighboring countries has touched most families personally in Israel. I will not be the first to suggest that that conflict has compelled Israelis and Jews abroad to give primacy to social solidarity, sometimes at the expense of fundamental rights. Jewish trauma is real, but we can't allow it to stymie us. This is a moment of crisis and a moment of great opportunity. Israel, from its inception, has been a project of the Jewish people, not just those who live there. Its survival and its character are our concern, and we're being asked by like-minded Israelis to engage in this struggle. Their commitment to protesting weekly for 9 months is inspiring and deserving of our support. My adopted Israeli father, Jonathan Friedland, who died just this year, used to say to me, "Do you want to sit on the sidelines or be part of the most important experiment of the Jewish people in 2,000 years?" All right, that's many years ago. Jonathan and Paula and their 2 kids, Josh and Tolly. And I think the person in yellow you know. 50 years from now, when the next generation is sitting in synagogue on Yom Kippur, a rabbi may ask, "What did your parents, grandparents, teachers, and mentors do when Israel faced its existential crisis in 2023? Do we want to say we did everything we could to strengthen Israel's democracy, or that we turned a blind eye while the government gutted the judiciary, turned Israel into a theocratic state, and bit by bit annexed the West Bank and continued to oppress Palestinians? What do we want to say?" Rabbi Moshe Avigdor Amiel, who was born in Lithuania and came to Israel in 1936 to serve as the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, taught what it means to approach Zionism out of love, even if it's difficult to do so. He taught that God's choice of the Jewish people does not confer extra rights on Jews. On the contrary, they impose on us duties of love for all nations and languages. He said, "Despite all of our disappointments, we never for a moment despaired of the future triumph of absolute justice." Despite all of our disappointments, we never for a moment despaired of the future triumph of absolute justice. That is the heart of Jewish faith. We are a people that believes in and is commanded to work constantly and unwaveringly for justice. The Talmud teaches, anyone who is able to protest the conduct of the members of their household and did not protest is held responsible for the sins of the members of their household. This moment in Israeli history is ripe with possibilities. Will we be on the side of justice and human rights, or be responsible for the sins of our co-religionists who are promoting racism and persecution? The choice is up to us. On the left, one of the protests in Tel Aviv, it says, "Titnagdu," resist, and then below it, the blue with the white, it says, "Vaikar lo lefached klal." You might recognize that from Kol Haolam Kulo, right? The world is a narrow bridge, and the essence is not to be afraid. There are many things that we can do. I prepared a sheet with examples of ways that we can take action. When you leave the sanctuary this evening, you can pick it up. I'm just going to name a few. I don't want to list off a whole bunch of things here for you. Instead, I would like us to focus on the message of the sermon, and you can take those with you. And tomorrow we will talk in the afternoon during our 2:15 study time together. But you can join the protests. Israelis on the street in Israel feel supported and encouraged when they see footage of Jews protesting around the world. And as I mentioned, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky was a lead signatory on a congressional letter in support of the protesters. If she's not your congressperson, I'm sorry about that. But you should reach out to yours, whoever they may be, and ask them to sign on. And another thing I would like to announce is that the Association for Civil Rights in Israel advocates across the broad spectrum of human rights and civil liberties for everyone living in Israel and in the occupied Palestinian territories. And the director of this organization, Rabbi Noah Satah, will be here at Beth Emet the weekend of November 3rd. Come and learn from her and see how we can support their work. Other ideas of what you can do will be on the handout when you lead services. And we'll also send it out in Emet Mail this week. In October 1973, Israel was thrown on the defensive during the first few days of the war. On the Golan Heights, 180 Israeli tanks faced an onslaught of 1,400 Syrian tanks. Along the Suez Canal, fewer than 500 Israeli soldiers were overwhelmed by Egyptian soldiers, backed by 2,000 tanks and more than 500 aircraft. Thankfully, Israel was able to mobilize its reserves and launch a counterattack. But close to 3,000 Israelis would be killed and many more maimed and injured during the conflict. Eternal political struggle may not evoke the same sense of urgency or fear as war, but we should be alarmed. We must be alarmed at what's happening in Israel, and we must respond before it's too late. Author and activist Michael Manikin, a member of an organization of left-wing Orthodox Jews called Smol Emuni, Faithful Left, teaches this from a Kabbalistic text, that the fast on Yom Kippur is necessary for the work of tshuva, of turning and repentance. Manikin writes, the fast is meant as a physical reminder of the pain of others. He adds, American Jews should support our Israeli counterparts who demonstrate in the streets as they speak out against the dangers of a government drunk on its own power and filled up with the hubris of perceived impunity, end quote. As we enter into this holy day and contemplate our lives in the year ahead, I want to conclude with this hopeful prayer for Israel's future, to uplift us and prepare us for the work ahead. This was written by the Israeli expat group Unacceptable. May it be your will that the state of Israel be blessed and continue to exist as a liberal democracy, respecting all its inhabitants and all forms of Judaism. May it be your will that the leaders and people of Israel will have the wisdom to listen to different voices and diverse viewpoints, manage the disputes, and take actions that benefit the community and the whole public. May it be your will that we have the strength to protect the judicial system's independence and preserve equal rights for all people who live in Israel, the territories under Israel's control, and all Jewish people worldwide. Amen.
Amen.